before we really get into our presentation, we want to start with a quick M&M experiment. So we need 3 volunteers. Thank you, Tommaso, Fred, and Alki. I really appreciate you guys volunteering. If you guys could come up here, it'll be real quick. No. So basically what's going to happen is we're going to have one distributor. Tom, you're going to do distributor.
Sweet.
Fred and Alki, please have a seat on the other side of the table. Tom, what I need you to do is stand over here so everyone can see you. And you need to pretend you don't know these guys at all. All right, you just met them, and you're given a bag of M&Ms. Sure. That. And you got to distribute it between them. You can distribute it any way you like. All you got to do is make sure there's no more M&Ms on that plate. Go. Just cup them in your hands. You can just give them that one.
Sure.
All right. So what you try to do here, Tom?
I try to distribute them kind of equally.
Kind of equally. All right, so what if I tell you, if we bring all the M&Ms back to the center, that Fred is the CEO of IKEA, and he makes $1 million a day, all right? And he's always eating. He's always in his car having a McDonald's. He has the money to afford it. And Alki here, he's homeless. He's unemployed. People don't recognize his intelligence.
He's a janitor at IKEA.
Yeah, he's a janitor at IKEA. He doesn't make, no, he's unemployed.
Unemployed.
And he's always starving. He averages 1 bread slice a day. And you're given the same bag of M&Ms, and you know this information. How would you distribute the M&Ms?
I would give them to Aki.
All of them?
Yes.
All right. Thanks, guys. You can have M&Ms if you want.
You can have as many.
So why do we do this? Why do we start with this kind of example? A, because we're trying to bribe Doxy, and B, because B, because it's a recurring theme throughout our presentation. It's something we want you guys to keep in mind as we go through the presentation. So don't forget about it. Just think about it. We'll explain and elaborate on it later. But next, that brings us into our real-world application. I'll tell you a little story about a man called Jussi Salonoja, 27-year-old from Finland. He's the heir to some huge meatpacking industry, and he earns 11.5 million per year. And he's driving along at the speed of 50 miles per hour in a 25 mile per hour zone, and consequently he's fined 200,000 euros. Now, comparing that to me, if I were in that situation with an allowance of 200 a year, if I were found speeding at the 50 miles per hour, I'd be fined 4 euro.
Yes.
Now let's compare that to me and Ido in England.
Yes.
Where the speeding fines are different. If we were speeding at 50 miles per hour, both of us, with different incomes, Ido being far richer than me, of course, we would still be fined the same amount.
Exactly.
So naturally, we found this was pretty interesting, and there's many approaches we could, take to sort of analyze the situation. There's a lot of moral and ethical implications and decisions that have to be made in making a decision like this.
In fact, we know that fining, speed fining, is a method of actually making sure that individuals do not break the law. Otherwise, they would have to face the consequences of actually paying a monetary fine. But we were interested in the different philosophical approaches that different governments take, whether it's like a flat fine like in England, or kind of a progressive fine in Denmark, which what did they call them again?
A sliding fine.
Sliding fine.
As in, the more you speed, the more you get. But yet, if 2 people are found speeding up by the same amount and they have different incomes,
yes.
They're so obviously there's a lot of premises, things to take into consideration. But what we really found is that there's sort of an overarching idea. Yes, we start with something so trivial and seemingly trivial and small, like a speeding fine. But the more we investigated, the more we found is that the ethical decisions, the philosophies involved with coming to that decision really apply to so many aspects of our life: education, tax, healthcare. So it's really not just limited to a speeding fine. It's so much bigger than that. And that leads us to our knowledge issue. Which moral principles guide governments, bureaucrats, institutions to make fair decisions? Now, it's pretty hard to define fair, and I think it's fair to say, okay, no one gets it. It's fair to say that Ido and I were sort of stumped on how to approach this, but upon helpful recommendation of Doxy, who sort of pointed us in the right direction, we found a key US philosopher called John Rawls, and he wrote a book on theory of justice. And he really started talking about this idea of distributive. Sorry, I can't find my page.
Distributive justice.
Yes.
Distributive justice, it pretty much deals with how do how do governments or institutions or policymakers, how do they choose to distribute society's scarce resources in a fair manner. So for one would choose to perhaps to lean towards equality and try to allocate those resources equally between the members of society, while others would prioritize other things such as social utilities for the general for all of society, and that's our focus in this presentation.
So now that we sort of have an idea of what distributive justice is, maybe you don't completely understand it, but we're going to split it up into two groups: egalitarianism and utilitarianism, and that's what Ida's going to talk about.
Yes. So hopefully, as we go along, you guys will have a better understanding of why of the different approaches. But egalitarianism is one of the simplest, but yet most profound principles, or should I say, rules in distributive justice, and it's related a lot to deontology, which we studied, in the sense that it prioritizes strict and radical equality in society. The principle is grounded in the idea that all members of society, all human beings, are morally equal. And therefore, making decisions that promote this equality, or more specifically, the equality of opportunities, are the kinds of decisions that give effect to this ideal. So, how would an egalitarian philosopher look at the speeding fine? So, since egalitarianism prioritizes equality for all and protecting the weaker members of society, an egalitarian would most likely prefer the progressive tax which Denmark issues. The progressive fine. Although it might seem that a country that issues the same fine under the same conditions, ceteris paribus, like in England, that might sound fair because each person would actually have to pay the same fine. But you have to consider that this fine represents a different proportion of an individual's income or wealth. So really, to promote equality, a progressive tax, in fact, a progressive tax is actually more considered towards the least advantaged members, the more vulnerable members, in such a way. Yes. So now we found a really interesting example, real-world example, with the country of Finland. And we truly believe that Finland follows a rather egalitarian approach in all of its, in many of its policies. So you can click another one. So one of their policies that they're famous for is their progressive inheritance tax. An inheritance tax is a tax that is levied on individuals' total estate once they die. Okay, a tax is a form of redistribution of redistribution of resources. The government uses this tax revenue to promote as it sees fit. Now, the inheritance tax here. Notice that for an individual earning 20,000 to 40,000 a year, only pays 100, whereas an individual with an estate value greater than €1 million would have to pay 149,700. But not only that, notice that the rate of the tax, the actual percentage of the tax, increases. So it's even more than just a regular progressive tax. It's in fact, it's really considerate of the poor, of the least advantaged, because obviously, when you tax an individual's lifelong estates, you're taxing a lot of money. The government of Finland takes out this money and redistributes it, but it's very considerate of the economically or financially disadvantaged in this case. And it would use this government ready to promote utility either through education, as we will talk about soon, health coverage, and minimum wage even. So can you get another one? So free education. Now, one of the extensions of that egalitarianists look at is that they say that individuals, they're born into different circumstances, which unfortunately they could be unfair. One thing they could be born into different families with different financial backgrounds. So an individual who would have to pay a tuition fee might not be able to do that, and therefore he would be deprived of education. So the government of Finland actually addresses this issue in favor of the less advantaged members. How does it do that? It fully subsidizes education, anywhere from kindergarten all the way up to high school, and even to universities, and even PhD seminaries and classes. It's all free. How does it do that? Tax revenue is one way, as we have demonstrated with inheritance tax. So in this sense, the government takes care of the poor, and it is very considerate of the different financial backgrounds that they come in. They're very sensitive to their needs in that sense, and that promotes equality. That reduces the gap, because in the long run, with education, the intent is that these individuals who would come from different financial backgrounds would then use education to later in life to hopefully to enjoy higher incomes, better jobs, better conditions. So in that sense.
All right, now that we have one side of the story, we can look at utilitarianism. Utilitarianism prioritizes social benefit and total welfare over equality. And Rawls explains utilitarianism as the idea that society is rightly ordered and therefore just, when its major institutions are arranged so as to achieve the greatest net balance of satisfaction summed over all the individuals belonging to it. And our old friend John Stuart Mill also has an insight into what utilitarianism is. And I quote, he says, "It's a theory based on the principle that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness." And a common phrase used to sort of define utilitarianism that we hear quite often in TOK is the greatest good for the greatest number. And Mills argues that even if an act is deemed unfair for the poor, it favors the greater number, then it should still be done. Now let's apply this kind of thinking to our speeding fine or speeding ticket situation. And to do that, we need to look at the sort of population size and what it consists of in terms of a speeding ticket. The main majority of people who get a speeding ticket own a car. And the main people that own a car usually belong to the middle class, or they have some kind of sustainable income. And this is in contrast with people who are dirt poor. So the people who have this sort of sustainable income would prefer a kind of tax where it's not related to income. But of course, this would more disadvantage the poor, as Ido sort of mentioned. And it also brings in this question the concept of slavery. And Rawls mentioned this in his book, saying that utilitarianism cannot absolutely rule out such systems as slavery or racial segregation. If slavery, for instance, is the overall benefit of society, in that the well-being of the slave owners outweighs the suffering of the slaves, then utilitarianism would be forced to accept slavery. Rawls maintains that this is a fundamental flaw in utilitarian thinking. Slavery is unjust under all circumstances, regardless of any utility calculations. It is unjust because it does not respect the fundamental rights and liberties of all individuals. Since utilitarianism allows such a trampling of individual rights, it must be discarded. The utilitarian answer to this criticism would be that slavery or racial segregation are never efficient enough to make them acceptable from the point of view of their moral theory. Virtually all utilitarians would condemn slavery But even though this is the right answer to the question of the justification of slavery, Rawls maintains that it is arrived for the wrong reasons. Slavery is not wrong because it is inefficient, but because it is unjust, because it does not consider individual rights inviolable. But it should be noted that Rawls' theory in no way rules out utility calculations in general. He simply maintains that such calculations may not override individual rights. Justice as fairness allows a society to be largely organized on utilitarian principles, as long as utility calculations do not interfere with the equality rights of all individuals. Moving on, one group of people that look into distributive justice is economists.
Absolutely.
And many people assert that economists, being social scientists, only analyze and make positive economic claims. These assertions reveal misconceptions about what distributive justice and economics are and how they are related.
So, the thing is, as Jaco lovely phrased it, the thing about utility is that that a lot of people actually criticize that it doesn't it refers to society as perhaps like a major entity rather than looking into specific individual needs. But that does not, if we look at, that doesn't mean that it's at all bad. I mean, as he pointed out, the thing about economists, that they look into, let's take an example of that could be analyzed by economists, which would be taxes. Okay, now let's say you have an economist A and economist B arguing about whether or not to raise or lower tax. Now, both of these economists agree that raising the tax, would in fact increase tax revenue, which could then which could then be used as to promote social utility in the society. So that's that's a positive claim. Okay, that's and there's a wide agreement about it amongst economists. Now, but this is where economists can take different approaches. Economist A could say, therefore, we should raise the taxes so that the government could earn more revenue, and then to increase social utility. Therefore, the government should increase taxes. This is a normative claim. But notice that this economist wants to increase utility through social utility via tax rates. Economist B, on the other hand, he might argue to lower tax rates on individuals and corporations because that would increase consumption in the economy and investment, and in turn would lead to economic growth economic growth. So in that sense, both of them agree that and that is a form of utility for societies. So notice that both of these economists actually look into utility that's what they have at the forefront of their minds.
All right, so as Ido and I, we sort of looked at what we learned. We evaluated utilitarianism and egalitarianism, and we were really stuck. We couldn't take a definite stance, but we arrived at this idea of reflective equilibrium, where two people of seemingly different ideals or moral principles or philosophies come together to reach a general consensus. And that's sort of the stance that we'd like to reflect.
Let me ask you a question. Now that you know about what we learned, do you think this is a serious question? Let's say you imagine you have two cars, okay, going over the speed limit by the same amount. Car A is driven by the head of IKEA, and the other car is driven by the janitor or an unemployed person that works in IKEA. Who do you think do you think they should be taxed the same or differently?
Just think for yourself.
Just
you don't have to answer.
So this is we struggled with that, Jaco and I. We couldn't really arrive, not only in this case, but we couldn't really choose one definite principle or school of thought or golden rule to follow at all times, that to strictly follow that in making all decisions. So, which is why we were compelled by Rawls' theory of idea of reflective equilibrium. This states that we should evaluate our moral principles in light of each specific case and then arrive at a reflected, coherent decision or a course of action that would apply to that specific scenario. And
Wanna
we
give you a 1-minute warning?
yes, we found a lot of comfort in that, which is kind of like what Tommaso and what Tommaso, Aki, and
Fred.
and Fred did here. They once they had another premise that we know, they heard that another one of them is actually unemployed. They reconsidered their course of action, knowing the specific case.
That's it.
That's it.
Because we have kind of a minute, because of the M&M thing, I sort of put it a little bit at 12:21. You know, we have that sort of principle of egalitarianism and this other sort of notion of